lost everything in the divorce, but what I did next changed everything." The courtroom was uncomfortably quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around your throat like a noose. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear the judge's words. But the expression on her husband's face told her everything. A smug, victorious smirk stretched across his lips as the gavel hit the desk. "The court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Division of assets awarded as presented." The words cut deeper than she imagined they would. She had walked into the courtroom hoping for fairness, or at least some form of dignity, but instead, she stood there, barely able to breathe, while everything she had built over the years was legally handed to the man who had systematically torn her down. Her name was Grace, and for the past 14 years, she had been a devoted wife, mother, and silent backbone to her husband's climbing career. She gave up her own dreams, paused her career, and poured herself into building a household, raising their daughter, and being available for every demand he threw her way. Now, she stood in front of him empty-handed, watching him leave the courthouse like he had just closed a successful business deal. "You don't deserve anything," he had whispered to her before the session started. At the time, she thought it was just venomous bitterness talking, but the ruling confirmed he had meant every word. Her lawyer placed a hand gently on her back, guiding her out as the courtroom began to clear. She couldn't feel her legs, nor the tears falling from her face. Her mind was spinning. How had she ended up here? How had the man who once wrote her poetry and held her hand during childbirth become this cold, calculated stranger? And worse, how had he convinced the court that she contributed nothing? She had the answer already. He had money, connections, and a story crafted so perfectly it barely resembled the truth. On the courthouse steps, she saw him embracing a younger woman, his assistant, she assumed, the one he insisted was just good with spreadsheets. She watched them laugh as if nothing had happened, as if 14 years could be swept into the trash without a trace of guilt. Grace turned away, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew that staring would only humiliate her further. Her hands were trembling as she clutched the empty folder that once held all the documents she believed would protect her. They had meant nothing. That night, Grace returned to a quiet apartment she barely recognized as her own. The furniture was borrowed from a cousin, the walls were bare, and the silence was suffocating. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her hands, and looked at them, hands that had cooked thousands of meals, cleaned every corner of their former house, and comforted a child through fevers and tears. How could those hands be seen as worthless? She had no answers, only a deep, hollow ache that made her chest feel like it was caving in. Grace had always thought that if the day came when she and David divorced, it would be a mutual, quiet farewell. But the process had been anything but. In the mediator's office, she sat across from him, pen in hand, staring at the agreement that stripped her of everything. The house, the savings, even her grandmother's piano, he had claimed it all. He didn't need the piano, he didn't even play. He just wanted her to walk away with nothing. And the most humiliating part wasn't the division of property, it was the smirk he wore the entire time, as if this moment was his personal victory lap. He didn't speak much, but when he did, every word was dipped in condescension. "You'll land on your feet, I'm sure. You're resourceful." The way he said it made her feel like a discarded appliance. Grace signed because she had no fight left in her, and no money left for a legal battle. She had spent everything trying to protect what she thought was rightfully hers, only to learn the hard way that the system didn't favor the silent contributor. As the final signature dried on the document, he stood, adjusted his designer jacket, and offered her a patronizing smile. "No hard feelings, right?" The assistant, yes, that assistant, hovered behind him like a shadow, pretending to not listen while clearly savoring every second. Grace remembered when she trained that very woman to organize David's business travel and manage his calendar. Now, that woman had taken her seat at his side, and it seemed she was the one getting the rewards for Grace's years of unseen work. As they left, Grace noticed that neither of them said goodbye. Not to her, not to the lawyer, not to the last decade and a half of their shared life. Outside the building, the cold hit her hard. She wrapped her coat tighter, feeling the wind slice through her like a blade. Her phone buzzed. It was a reminder that her bank balance had hit a new low. She laughed, not because anything was funny, but because she realized she couldn't even afford to cry somewhere comfortable. The reality of her new life was settling in fast, and it was bitter. Grace had always believed that some things were untouchable, like the old cabin her grandfather left her in Vermont. It was in her name, a family legacy that had stood untouched through the storms of life. But during the proceedings, David's lawyers argued that since she allowed him to renovate it during the marriage and used joint funds to maintain it, the property was marital. She had scoffed at the idea at first, thinking no judge would agree. But again, she was wrong. David took the cabin too. Losing the house and the savings hurt, but losing that cabin was something else entirely. It wasn't just a building, it was memory. It was childhood summers, fireflies, the smell of pine wood, and her grandfather's laugh echoing in the halls. David never even liked the place. He called it primitive. But when it came time to divide assets, suddenly it became strategic property worth keeping. Grace had no money to appeal the ruling. The court documents were clear, and so was the judge's tone: marital asset, case closed. When she told her younger brother about the cabin, his silence on the phone was deafening. "How could you let him take it?" he asked finally. And she had no answer. How could she explain the fatigue, the hopelessness, the shame of being crushed again and again by a man who knew how to smile in court and lie through his teeth? Grace simply replied, "I didn't let him. I just couldn't stop him." Grace hadn't expected the words to come from David's mouth so casually, but they did. During one of their last conversations, if it could even be called that, he turned to her and said, "Let's be honest. You didn't bring anything to the table. You didn't earn. You didn't build the company. You were just a housewife." The word just echoed in her head like a fire alarm. Just a housewife. Just someone who raised their child, who kept his world spinning while he chased his ambitions. He said it like she had chosen the easy route, like he had carried the weight of their lives alone. It wasn't just the words. It was the expression behind them. He truly believed it. In his eyes, everything she did, the meals, the bills paid on time, the emotional labor, the social hosting, the sacrifices, none of it counted. Not in dollars, so not in worth. Grace stood there, hearing the man she once trusted with her future reduce her entire existence to a footnote in his success story. That moment didn't just hurt, it erased her. What he never understood was that she chose that role. She had a degree. She had a career once. But they made a decision together, back when their daughter was born, that she would stay home. Back when he used to say, "No one else I'd trust more to raise our child." Now, that choice had become ammunition against her. It was no longer noble or admirable, it was failure. At least in his eyes. The apartment was on the third floor of a worn-down building tucked behind a strip mall. The elevator groaned every time it moved, and the hallway smelled faintly of burnt toast and cigarette smoke. But it was all she could afford, and even then, barely. She had no furniture, only a mattress, a coffee pot, and the remnants of a life she never thought she'd have to carry alone. Grace placed her last box on the chipped linoleum floor and stood in silence, trying to imagine the space as home. Every echo of her footsteps reminded her how empty it was. She missed the creaky wooden floors of the old house, the hum of the dishwasher, the art projects her daughter used to leave on the kitchen table. But none of that was hers anymore. Her daughter now lived full-time with David, at least for now, because the judge believed stability meant staying in the big house. Grace didn't fight it. She didn't have the money for a custody battle. Temporary, the judge had said. But it didn't feel temporary. At night, the silence screamed. She tried to sleep, but memories had a way of crawling under the blankets. Every corner of the apartment reminded her of what she'd lost, and not just material things. It was the identity, the sense of place, the feeling of being someone in someone else's world. Now, she was no one, and this apartment was her starting line, cold, unfamiliar, and honest. Because for the first time in years, no one was pretending. Grace had always suspected something was wrong long before the divorce papers arrived. There had been late nights, unexplained trips, and cold silences at home. But she forced herself to believe in the good, in the man she once married. It wasn't until she stumbled upon an old email thread, left open on a borrowed laptop, that the truth finally surfaced. His assistant, the woman who used to call her Mrs. Langford with a forced smile, had written him messages far too personal, too intimate to ignore. One of them ended with, "I can't wait for us to finally be public." It was dated 6 months before the divorce began. There was no confrontation. Grace didn't have the energy for theatrics. Instead, she sat there alone in her apartment, reading every message like an autopsy of her marriage. Each line confirmed that she hadn't imagined the emotional distance, the odd tension during dinners, the sudden shift from me to me in his vocabulary. He had replaced her emotionally before he ever left physically. And yet, he still fought for everything, not just the marriage, but the house, the assets, their daughter. Betrayal was one thing. But the need to humiliate her in the process, that was something darker. She had agreed to attend the family dinner only because her daughter had begged her. "Please, Mom. Just this one time. Everyone will be there." Grace assumed it was a gesture of closure, perhaps an effort to show civility in front of their child. But the evening unfolded into something very different. As she entered the restaurant, heads turned, not out of admiration, but from a quiet, collective judgment that stung like acid. His parents greeted her with the sort of icy politeness reserved for unwanted guests, while his sister barely acknowledged her presence at all. As the wine flowed, so did the veiled insults. His mother leaned across the table with a soft smile and said, "We all wondered how David managed to carry everything for so long. You were charming, but never quite driven, were you?" Grace swallowed hard, offering a forced smile, not for them, but for her daughter, who sat quietly with wide eyes. Even David joined the mockery, laughing as his brother joked about deadweight spouses. Grace stared at her untouched plate, cheeks burning with humiliation. She had once called these people family. Now they looked at her like a failed project. Determined not to sink, Grace spent her days drafting resumes, sending applications, and hoping that someone out there would see past the years she'd spent at home. But the world outside the home had moved on without her. Employers saw a gap in her history and called it a concern. Her degree, once respected, was now considered dated. "You're overqualified for admin work, but underqualified for leadership roles," one recruiter said, clearly trying to soften the blow. Grace smiled politely and left, hiding the sting behind her coat collar as she stepped into the cold air. There was a moment, after her 5th rejection in a week, when she sat on a park bench and truly wondered if her life had any trajectory left. Her confidence had eroded not from failure, but from the persistent sense that she no longer belonged anywhere. The world had no place for a 41-year-old woman whose primary skill set involved unpaid labor. She had managed a household, solved crises, balanced budgets, but none of it came with a certificate or title. To the professional world, she was invisible. And slowly, she began to feel that way too. It was an ordinary morning. Grace had stepped out to clear her mind after yet another sleepless night. She sipped a cheap coffee from the corner cart and wandered without purpose, stopping briefly at the courthouse steps where her life had unraveled. That's when she saw him, the same judge who had presided over her divorce case. He stood in plain clothes, reading a newspaper beside the statue outside the building. For a second, Grace hesitated, unsure if she should turn away or say something. But something inside her stirred. She walked over and quietly said, "You probably don't remember me." He looked up, surprised at first, then nodded slowly. "Mrs. Langford, yes. I remember." His tone was polite, measured. Grace didn't expect apologies, but something in her wanted him to know. "You said I brought nothing to the marriage," she said softly. "But everything he built it with my silence holding the walls together." The judge seemed taken aback. "Sometimes, the law isn't always fair," he admitted. "It's just the law." It was a small moment, but it gave her a sliver of peace. Not justice. Just recognition that she wasn't crazy, or forgotten, or entirely erased. Months later, Grace received an unexpected invitation in the mail, an alumni gala for the company where David now sat proudly as CEO. Her name was still listed in the system, a relic from the years she had helped him build that business from their kitchen table. Curious, and perhaps foolishly hopeful, she went. She wore a simple black dress, her hair tied back, nothing extravagant, but elegant. As she entered the ballroom, heads turned again. But this time, the looks weren't pitying. They were puzzled, intrigued. People whispered, unsure if she was who they thought she was. And then she saw him, David, laughing loudly in a circle of executives. When he noticed her, his smile faltered. "Grace?" he asked, as if she didn't belong. "I thought you wouldn't come." She looked him in the eye and replied, "I wasn't invited for you." His new partner, yes, the assistant, clung to his arm, visibly uncomfortable. As the night wore on, Grace didn't cling to any walls or shadows. She spoke with former colleagues, many of whom expressed genuine surprise at seeing her. One even said, "You were always the one behind his success." Everyone knew it. For the first time in a long time, Grace began to believe it, too. After dozens of unanswered applications, Grace accepted the only offer she received, a temp position at a small community center library. It wasn't glamorous, and it barely paid enough to cover rent, but it offered her something she hadn't felt in a while: purpose. Her job involved sorting donations, organizing books, and helping elderly patrons navigate the new computer system. At first, it felt beneath her experience, but as the days passed, she began to find comfort in the routine. She worked mostly in silence, surrounded by shelves and stories. She met people who thanked her just for helping them print a document or find a novel they hadn't read in years. There were no performance reviews or suits walking by judging her. Just genuine moments of connection. For the first time in months, she returned home without the familiar weight of failure crushing her chest. The job wasn't what she expected, but neither was this new version of herself that was beginning to rise quietly from the ashes. One Wednesday afternoon, while organizing the donation bin, a woman in her late 60s approached Grace. She wore a tailored coat and carried herself like someone who used to be feared in boardrooms but now preferred books to board meetings. "You're efficient," she said, watching Grace work. "And calm. That's rare." Grace smiled awkwardly, unsure what to say. "I used to be a different kind of organized," she replied. The woman didn't ask questions. Instead, she handed Grace a card and said, "If you're ever interested in working on something more creative, call me." Grace put the card in her pocket, thinking it was just another person offering vague encouragement. But that night, curiosity got the best of her. She searched the name and was stunned. The woman was a retired executive who now ran a boutique consulting firm helping women relaunch stalled careers. Grace wasn't sure if she belonged in that category, but something about the invitation felt different. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. And for the first time in a long time, someone saw beyond her silence. When Grace agreed to meet for coffee, she didn't expect much. She figured it would be a polite conversation, maybe some generic advice. But instead, the woman, whose name was Eleanor, asked sharp, insightful questions. "What did you actually do during your marriage? Don't tell me about titles. Tell me about tasks, decisions, things you managed." As Grace listed them, she realized how much she had handled: budgeting, scheduling, negotiation with vendors for David's events, project planning for community fundraisers. Eleanor scribbled on a napkin. "You're not a beginner. You're a dormant strategist. You just forgot." Those words stayed with Grace. She went home, pulled out an old laptop, and began writing everything she used to do, not emotionally, but professionally. Skills. Achievements. Projects. It was like dusting off a part of herself she had buried. The list kept growing, and with it, so did her sense of identity. She wasn't starting from zero. She was simply starting again. Eleanor introduced her to a small team of women working on a civic redesign project for local parks. "We don't need degrees," she said. "We need competence and grace under pressure. You've got both." Grace joined cautiously at first, afraid she would embarrass herself. But within weeks, she was organizing timelines, creating presentation slides, and coordinating community meetings. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The spark in her brain, dulled by years of repetition and rejection, reignited. At the project's final presentation, a city official approached her and said, "You're incredibly composed. Ever think of leading your own project?" Grace didn't know how to answer. Her mind still echoed with David's words, "You were just a housewife." But those words were beginning to sound like a lie. With each small victory, a compliment here, a task completed there, Grace realized she didn't need to become someone new. She just needed to remember who she had been before she gave everything away. There was no grand breakthrough, no dramatic transformation. Just quiet days filled with meaningful work and a growing sense that she wasn't broken, just bruised. Grace no longer flinched when someone asked what she did. She had something to say now, and it didn't begin with "I used to." She walked taller, smiled more often, and even started taking her daughter out for weekends again. The judge had finally agreed to shared custody once Grace proved she had stable income. On one of those weekends, they walked past a group of mothers talking about career changes. One of them turned to Grace and said, "What do you do?" For a brief second, Grace hesitated. But then she answered, I help cities design better public spaces. I manage strategy and operations. Her daughter looked up at her, beaming with pride. And Grace felt it, she had come back to herself. Not by revenge or rage, but by rediscovering the worth that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Late one evening, Grace received a message from Eleanor marked urgent but exciting. The city was assembling a task force to advise on community development grants, and they wanted someone with real-life project experience. They asked for you by name, Eleanor said. Grace stared at the email, stunned. Just a year ago, she couldn't get a response from a receptionist. Now, her name was being passed around in professional rooms, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone capable and respected. Though nervous, Grace accepted the invitation. She sat at a polished conference table surrounded by city officials, consultants, and nonprofit leaders. When she spoke, people listened. Her ideas weren't just heard, they were implemented. It was surreal at first. But she had earned her seat, and she knew it. And in that room, far from the cold courtroom where she had been dismissed, Grace realized that her story no longer began with what was taken, but with what she had built since. After a presentation, Grace stepped outside for air. Eleanor followed, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You're doing more than rebuilding your career, she said. You're restoring your dignity. Grace looked down, overwhelmed by the weight of that word. Dignity. For so long, she had associated it with silence, keeping her head down, not making a fuss. But now, she understood it differently. Dignity wasn't about quiet endurance. It was about knowing your value and refusing to let others rewrite your worth. That night, Grace sat on her balcony, the city lights blinking gently in the distance. For the first time in ages, she allowed herself to feel proud. Not just for surviving, but for thriving in a world that once told her she had nothing left. She had started with an empty apartment and shattered self-esteem. Now she had purpose, stability, and a growing belief in her ability to shape the world around her. And no one, not even David, could take that from her again. At the next planning session, Grace was asked to lead a multi-department collaboration, an unspoken promotion. There were no confetti or announcements. Just new responsibilities, more trust, and a wider circle of influence. It wasn't about title inflation or ego boosts. It was about something deeper, respect. The kind of respect she never received in her marriage, where her labor was invisible and her opinions dismissed as emotional noise. Now, every spreadsheet she created, every solution she proposed, was seen as valuable. As she organized her new workflow, she paused at her desk, touching the surface with her fingertips. The desk wasn't expensive. The office wasn't grand. But it was hers. She earned it not by shouting, but by showing up, consistently, quietly, excellently. Grace had finally found something that couldn't be divided, taken in court, or signed away, her own voice, sharpened by hardship and now being heard without apology. One afternoon, Grace stopped by a business conference to support a colleague's presentation. As she moved through the crowd, she heard a familiar voice. David. He was speaking to a small group, pitching himself as a visionary in sustainable business. She hadn't seen him in over a year, but his tone hadn't changed, confident, rehearsed, charming. He hadn't seen her yet, but when he finally turned and locked eyes with her, his expression faltered. He approached, clearly surprised. Grace? I didn't expect to see you here. She gave a small nod. I'm consulting on a few city projects, she replied calmly. David looked momentarily disoriented, unsure how to respond. She was no longer someone he could dismiss or control. She wasn't in his shadow anymore. She stood there in her own light, steady and unshaken. And for once, David had nothing clever to say. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at her door. It was from David's attorney. Grace's stomach dropped. She opened it carefully and read through the pages. He was suing for control of a shared investment they had once built together, something she had long forgotten, a small tech fund started in their early years. He claimed it was his idea, that she had no right to its recent gains. Grace closed the file and stared at the ceiling. But she didn't panic. Not this time. She called her new legal contact, calmly explained the situation, and began gathering documentation. For the first time, she had more than memories, she had evidence. And she had people who believed in her. The battle wasn't over. But she was no longer the woman who signed documents with trembling hands. She was prepared. This time, she wasn't just defending herself, she was standing for everything she had rebuilt from the ground up. The courtroom felt eerily familiar, but this time, Grace walked in differently. Her back was straight, her presence composed. The man who once stripped her of everything now sat at the opposite bench, nervously avoiding her gaze. She was no longer pleading to be heard, she had built her case meticulously. Bank records, signed documents, emails, everything was there. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. And this time, she had a voice that carried weight. The judge was new, but the questions were sharp. David's team tried to paint her as irrelevant again, claiming she had no role in the tech investment. But Grace's attorney calmly revealed her detailed involvement, her signatures on early agreements, and even handwritten notes where David acknowledged her input. The room shifted. No longer was she the quiet ex-wife in the background. Now she was the woman whose presence could rewrite a courtroom narrative. In a twist of irony, David's new attorney was a former colleague of Grace's old friend. As the proceedings unfolded, Grace caught subtle hesitations in the woman's voice. It became clear she hadn't been told the full truth about David's past behavior. During recess, the woman approached Grace and said, "You were the one who built the original fund documents, weren't you?" Grace nodded. "I was." The next day, that same lawyer stood before the judge and requested time to review newly submitted materials. Grace didn't gloat. She simply sat still, heart pounding. Something had shifted. Not just the momentum of the case, but the narrative itself. David's team had come expecting a broken woman. Instead, they found a professional, fully prepared, whose competence could no longer be dismissed or minimized. On the fourth day of the hearing, Grace was called to testify. She walked to the stand with quiet certainty. Her voice didn't shake, and her story didn't wander. She spoke of the fund's beginnings, the nights spent researching trends while David traveled, the spreadsheets she managed, and the financial strategy she developed alone while raising their daughter. The courtroom was silent. Even David didn't interrupt. He looked smaller now, uncomfortable, out of place. Grace wasn't emotional. She was clear, logical, and impossible to discredit. When she finished, the judge looked directly at her and said, "Thank you." That was illuminating. The tone carried something she hadn't felt in court before, respect. And in that moment, she knew, no matter the verdict, she had already reclaimed something far greater. A former colleague from David's early business days was brought in as a witness. Unexpectedly, he turned the tide. "I always assumed Grace was behind the structure of the fund," he said. "David talked a lot, but she was the one who followed through. She handled the details." David objected, but the damage was done. The courtroom could see the cracks forming in his story. That single testimony reframed everything. Grace wasn't an accessory. She was foundational. The judge scribbled notes rapidly, eyebrows raised. Even the court reporter paused, clearly taken aback by the shift. Grace sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. There was no need for celebration. What she felt was deeper than triumph. It was truth, finally allowed to breathe. The final ruling came on a rainy morning. Grace sat in the courtroom, calm but alert. The judge began by acknowledging the prior divorce judgment. This court recognizes the new evidence brought forth, and finds that the plaintiff's role in the disputed fund was not only substantial but essential. David flinched. Grace didn't move. Then came the words she'd waited a lifetime to hear. This court awards the respondent a controlling share of the fund and recognizes her full legal contribution to its origin and growth. Silence hung in the air. David looked stunned. Grace closed her eyes for a brief second, not to cry, but to breathe. Justice hadn't come swiftly, but it had come. And this time, the system didn't just see her. It believed her. As the judge's decision echoed through the room, a strange stillness followed. No clapping, no celebration, just a heavy, profound silence that felt louder than any cheer. Grace didn't smile, but her eyes held something steady and radiant. Around her, she noticed a few subtle nods, strangers, colleagues, even the court staff, silent gestures of acknowledgement. No one had expected her to win. Fewer still had expected her to do it with such composure. David remained seated, stunned and pale, his expression frozen in disbelief. For years, he had spun a version of their history that made him the sole architect of success. That version had just been dismantled in front of a judge. Grace stood and gathered her documents, moving with quiet dignity. She didn't look at David again. There was no point. Her closure didn't need his recognition. The court had already given her the only acknowledgement she needed. News of the ruling spread quickly through professional circles. A business journal published an article, "Behind Every Empire, the wife who was the builder all along." Grace's name was no longer a footnote. It was a headline. Meanwhile, David began canceling appearances, declining interviews. Rumors swirled about tension within his company board, concerns about his judgment, and shareholders questioning the credibility of his leadership. Grace didn't celebrate his downfall, she didn't need to. She was too focused on building her future to waste time watching his collapse. But she couldn't ignore the irony. The man who once humiliated her publicly now avoided the spotlight he used to crave. His silence was the loudest admission of all. And while he scrambled to protect his image, she quietly received invitations to speak at conferences, to advise startups, and to mentor women who, like her, had once been erased. Grace used her newly awarded assets not for revenge, but for rebirth. She invested in a women-led consulting firm offering career relaunch programs and legal guidance for women emerging from long-term domestic partnerships. She refused to let others experience the legal blindness she once faced. Her work wasn't just professional, it was personal. And that made every success more meaningful. Each morning, she walked into an office filled with people who saw her as a leader. Not just for her titles or experience, but for her story. She shared it not as a tale of bitterness, but as proof that silence doesn't mean weakness, and that starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing. Her days were full now, of meetings, mentoring, writing, and of something she hadn't felt in years, certainty. She no longer questioned her value. She embodied it. Months later, Grace received an email. The sender, David. It was brief. No excuses, no explanations. Just one line, "I was wrong. I see that now. I'm sorry." She read it twice, then closed the tab. There was no anger, no satisfaction. Just a strange, hollow calm. He had taken so much from her, and now tried to return something intangible, acknowledgement. But it came too late to matter. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her life had moved on, and more importantly, had grown without him. Grace had become her own story's author. His voice no longer dictated her narrative. What once would have shattered her now barely caused a ripple. That was healing, not in dramatic gestures, but in choosing peace over resentment. She hadn't won just in court. She had won in life. Grace stood at the podium of a local university, delivering the keynote for a graduation ceremony. She wore a navy dress, hair pulled back, posture proud. "There was a time," she told the crowd, "when I thought I had lost everything. And maybe I had, at least the life I knew. But losing that life gave me something better, the chance to rebuild with purpose." As applause filled the hall, she stepped back, tears pricking her eyes, but not from sadness. From fullness. From gratitude. She had faced the courtroom with nothing but truth. She had rebuilt her career from scratch. She had gone from forgotten to respected, from discarded to indispensable. And it all began the day she lost everything. Because what she didn't know then, but knew now, was that sometimes, the end isn't an ending. It's a door to something greater.